Hey everybody, it's Pastor Bryan Ross from Grace Life Bible Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We want to welcome you once again to this midweek video and to our YouTube channel here. If you haven't already done so, if you would consider subscribing and ringing the alarm bell as a way of staying current with the ministry when we go live from the assembly building, as well as when we create content for you here midweek, we would certainly appreciate that. Also want to remind you about our Rumble channel. We established this as an alt-text site should something happen to our YouTube channel. So if you're into alt-text sites or would just like an alternative to YouTube, please check us out here as well. My featured books this week are once again my co-authored book with my former professor, Dr. Dale DeWitt, J.C. O'Hare, and the Origins of the American Grace Movement. This book is a full-length featured church history book covering the life and ministry of J.C. O'Hare as the fountainhead of the American Mid-Acts Grace Movement here in the United States. So if you're into the history of dispensationalism and want to know more about this important historical figure, please consider picking up a copy of the O'Hare book, as well as the Bullinger book, Rightly Dividing E.W. Bullinger, Assessing His Life, Ministry, and Impact. This book is a sketch of Bullinger's life with a focus on articulating and getting to the bottom of how the Acts 28 dispensational position emerged in the life and ministry of E.W. Bullinger. So if you're into the history of dispensationalism, both of these would be good for you to pick up and check out, and I'm sure you would learn a lot from doing so. As you know, those of you that have been following the channel, we've been working our way the last number of weeks towards finishing our review and analysis of the rise and fall of dispensationalism, how the evangelical battle over the end times shaped a nation, by Daniel G. Hummel. And so we've been building out this playlist here every week, and I'm trying to get this done before the end of 2023. We started this way back in May of this year, the same month that Hummel released his book, and we've been working through this. We got interrupted a little bit towards the late summer, early fall by some other projects that we had on our plate. So we're trying to get this done before the end of the year. So I'm thinking 2 videos this week and then possibly 1 next week between Christmas and New Year's. And that should wrap up our analysis and make the deadline. So where are we right now? Right now we are in part 3 of the book, which is on pop dispensationalism, 1960 to 2020. And we are in chapter 17, saturation and its limits, televangelists and electric dispensationalism, CCM and the pop dispensational complex, mega dispensationalism and its limits, and then Southern Baptists and sectional reproachment continued. Okay, so as always, in every subsection, regardless of how, in every chapter, I should say, regardless of how many subsections Hummel has, he always has an introduction to the chapter. Chapter 17 begins on page 283, and you can see that after this, there are 2 chapters left. So if we do 2 this week and 1 next week, we should make our deadline of finishing this before the end of 2023. So getting started with chapter 17, saturation and its limits, page 283. Okay, here's how this begins. The summer of 1988 was abuzz with talk of the rapture. An unknown writer, Edgar C. Wisnat of Little Rock, Arkansas, had gone viral with a pamphlet titled 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Happen in 1988. Now, I have to admit that before I read Hummel's book, I thought Hal Lindsey, wrote 88 Reasons Why the Rapture would be in 1988. I did not realize that it was this other gentleman. And the reason I was confused is because if you recall, when we looked at the chapter on late great planet Earth, Lindsey had a calculation about why he thought the rapture would be in 1988. Okay. But anyway, 1988 is where we are, and this book is going viral. This pamphlet is going viral. Over the first half of the year, more than 300,000 copies were mailed to pastors, and more than 4 million copies were sold across the country. The upshot of Wisnat's argument was clear. The rapture would occur on the Jewish holiday of Rosh Hashanah between September 11 and September 13, 1988. Matthew 24:36 states that no man knows about the day or the hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son of God, only the Father. Wisnat admitted before adding, quote, "This does not preclude, or prevent the faithful from knowing the year, the month, and the week of the Lord's return. A NASA engineer turned prophecy expert, Weinsnett diverged from any textbook definition of dispensationalism, even as he was unmistakably part of its legacy. His pamphlets included references to early century prophecy chart, designer Clarence Larkin, and the Schofield Reference Bible, but Weinsnett cited no living dispensational scholars that had affiliations with dispensational institutions. The 88 reasons gave range to the familiar to the incredible. So there's a range, okay, from some familiar concepts to some like new outlandish concepts. The bulk of Weinsnett's argument was based on an intricate numerology. Reason 78, for example, explained that from 28 AD, when Jesus revealed himself to the apostles as the Son of God, John 5:10 through 38, we have 28 AD plus 7 times 280 equals 1988, the rapture of the church year. The math was straightforward in Weinsnett's telling. 7 means complete, and 280 means the gestation period of a human child. Therefore, the numbers would say that the complete gestation period of the church has been accomplished, and the church is now ready to be born into the eternity of the house of God in heaven. Okay, so there's so many problems with this. First of all, the church of this dispensation did not start in John 5. It started with the salvation and conversion of Saul of Tarsus in Acts 9. Yes, I am a mid-Acts dispensationalist, and unabashedly so. So there's major problems with this, and now this is going to be a date setting, okay? Now, we've talked about this in the past, in the 19th century, the 1800s, with the Great Disappointment and the Millerites, and how they set this day for the Lord's return, and it comes and goes, and of course, everybody laughs, and how foolish. Well, the same thing's going on here with this date setting with the rapture, okay? Weinsnett's viral pamphlet was revealing. The new Christian right had adopted pop dispensationalism into its political program, but this was only one part of its legacy. In the 1980s and 1990s, pop dispensationalism spread into virtually every sector of American culture. On screens and in bookstores, over the airwaves and in pews, pop dispensational productions continued to sell into the millions to the faithful and seekers alike. Through many mutations and shifting religious cultures, pop dispensationalism itself was evolving in unexpected ways. In the electric church of televangelism, in Christian contemporary music, in megachurches helmed by dispensational pastors, and in other institutional contexts. All told, the saturation of pop dispensationalism was a multivariate and complex process, testifying to the resilience of pop dispensational concepts, even in the face of a rapidly disintegrating dispensational theological community. So the point is, dispensationalism is going to pop dispensationalism is going to show up everywhere now. And again, this is a watered down dispensationalism that is basically known by its end time scenario. Okay, this is not a robust dispensational understanding that has all the scriptural, historical, theological framework to support it. It's just dispensationalism stripped down to its end time scenario. Okay, now getting now into the first subsection, televangelists and electric dispensationalism. The heyday of televangelism in the 1970s and 80s picked up where the initial explosion of pop dispensational cultural production had left off. On television, as Neil Postman wrote in Amusing Ourselves to Death, 1985. By the way, Amusing Ourselves to Death is an excellent book that still has much to say about our current cultural situation as far as how we are amusing and entertaining ourselves to death here in America. But here's what he said in 1985. Religion, like everything else, is presented quite simply and without apology as entertainment. Now, that has long been an analysis of the modern evangelical church by some of us mid-Acts dispensationalists, that all it is entertainment. Okay, now this is Neil Postman in 1985 writing and Entertaining Ourselves to Death, and his analysis is religion, like everything else, is presented quite simply and without apology as entertainment. After watching hours of televangelist programming, Postman concluded that there was, quote, no theology and above all, no sense of scriptural transcendence on display. In televangelism, the preacher is tops. God comes out as second banana. That's what he wrote. That was a quote. Pop dispensationalism's fate was implicated in the basic potential and limitations of the medium of television. So what Postman is identifying is that this is just all a bunch of entertainment, okay? Now, pop dispensationalism shows up in this entertainment complex to the extent that it is needed, all right? Now, he gets into a big thing here about the electric church on page 285. He talks about the National Religious Broadcasters Association, how Christian programming became to be a thing over the 1970s and early 1980s, and it ballooned to include more than 70 national televised religious programs, okay? Now, some of you that are a little bit older than me, you'll probably have a little bit better memory of this. I was still a kid in the 1980s. I can thankfully say that I don't recall my parents watching a lot of this type of televangelism. It just wasn't something that was in our house. According to Hummel, by 1980, weekly viewer numbers were pegged by the Nielsen Ratings Board at around 15 million people are watching this program, with more than 80% of the programming dedicated to independent evangelical groups. Annual donations to television ministries reach hundreds of millions of dollars by the 1980s. Media scrutiny of televangelism was as important as viewing numbers for introducing Americans to the prominent televangelists and their pop dispensational messages. By 1981, sociologists Jeffrey K. Hardin and Charles E. Swan were attributing at least part of the success of the new Christian right to televangelism. Social commentators like Neil Postman were hailing televangelism as the apex or nadir of the media of television. Norman Lear, longtime TV show runner and founder of the liberal advocacy group People for the American Way, was producing a televangelist survey that routinely aggregated controversial clips to circulating among its hundreds of thousands of members. The constant, often alarmist coverage of televangelists did bring attention to their excess, but the more lasting contribution was to introduce millions of Americans by way of sound bites and quotes to the terminology of pop dispensationalism. A few of the new Christian right's leading figures, including Jerry Falwell, Old Time Gospel Hour, Pat Robertson's The 700 Club, and Southern Baptist firebrand James Robeson Presents, had built their platforms on the back of televangelism. The format, aided by new digital databases that could generate vast mailing lists, allowed for expanded fundraising, brand awareness, and growth. The medium was gilded and glossy, depicting an idealized setting, unusually touched with some Southern charm, reflecting the demographics of televangelists themselves, famous guests and musical talent, and a telegenic pastor. The same qualities that produced television stars and celebrities were at work in televangelism, giving new right Christian leaders a unique platform to spread their ideas and accrue influence. But the televangelists with the largest audiences were less interested in directly mobilizing Christian voters. Aging stars Oral Roberts and You, Rex Humbard, Inspiration, continued to pull some of the largest audiences. The younger generation made the most cultural impact. Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, the PTL Club, Jimmy Swaggart, the Jimmy Swaggart Telecast, and Paul and Jan Crouch, Trinity Broadcasting Network, were all far more popular in the 1970s and 80s and less directly politically active than the new Christian right televangelists. They were watched by millions of Americans and indeed millions more global viewers, fueling media and real-world infrastructure from the satellite networks to new Bible colleges. Like Lindsay in the 1970s, their aims were independent and existing institutional interests. Their primary goals were to build their audience and to accrue a war chest for future expansion. The televangelists pursued these goals by exploiting the strengths of television. Radio preachers had pioneered an engagement with dispensational theology that tried to apply the whole system of dispensationalism to social and cultural life. J. Vernon McGee through the Bible, Martin Ralph DeHaan's radio Bible class of the air were structured, even in their titles, to be an expository exercise through consistent and systematic engagement with the Bible would educate listeners to be better Christians. Televangelism took a different route. The Baker's PTL Club had a variety show format, while Oral Roberts and You resembled a late-night talk show. Televangelists were often ignorant of the way the medium of televangelism shaped their theology, but they intuited well enough that certain formats entertained better than others. So this is a big deal. Like the era of Christian radio of J. Vernon McGee and DeHaan, for example, is explicitly about biblical exposition, taking people through the Bible and trying to explain the biblical text. This televangelism stuff now is mostly just about sheer entertainment, and the theology is now packaged for the relative entertainment value that it is perceived to have. On the screen, televangelists stimulated interest in charismatic renewal, but as they gained audiences, their rhetoric tended towards the common denominator that could appeal across the spectrum of fundamentalists and evangelicals, Pentecostals, charismatics, and potential converts. For virtually every televangelist, the baseline entailed a pop dispensationalism that supplied a grab bag of near-future concepts that could mix easily with Pentecostal teachings and cast a wide net for potential viewers. Now, let me just say, I went through my own when I was in Bible college in the late 90s, I went through my own sort of phase of watching Christian television because I was fascinated by it to see how off the mark I thought they were. And this description here, a baseline entertained a pop dispensationalism that supplied a grab bag of concepts that could mix easily with Pentecostal teachings and cast a wide net for potential viewers. I think Hummel is right on the spot there with what he observed with this televangelism. Okay, engagement with pop dispensationalism rarely ranged beyond the standard scenario: cultural decline blamed on humanism, geopolitical chaos, rapture, tribulation, Antichrist, Armageddon, and finally the second coming. So there again, that's dispensational truth reduced to its end time scenario. Now, I remember seeing John Hagee do this. I remember seeing he was probably the most blatant one, but there were others. Perry Stone, some of these guys, the guy out of Muncie, Indiana, Steve Muncie, all these guys, they have this grab bag of theological concepts that they're now putting out on the TV. While there were many ways to summarize televangelism in the 1980s, encapsulating the role of dispensationalism is more difficult, in part because none of the televangelists took much interest in the inner workings of any particular theology. I agree with that. For the majority of televangelists, dispensationalism was mediated through shared denominational background in the Assemblies of God and the dissemination of pop dispensationalism in the 1970s. Largely sidelined in fundamentalist modernist controversies, the Assemblies of God had incorporated premillennial eschatology from its founding, but otherwise developed outside the boundaries of fundamentalism. Its position on speaking in tongues, divine healing, and the quote later reign of signs and wonders ran against the fundamentalist grain. In 1943, the Assemblies of God was the largest body to join the new National Association of Evangelicals, signaling its desire to work with neo-evangelicals who wanted to pitch a wide Protestant tent in the service of a united Christian front against secularism and communism. On the points of agreement between Pentecostals and neo-evangelicals was a shared alienation from scholastic dispensationalism. This alienation manifested conspicuously in the televangelist craze of the 1970s when pop dispensationalism was pervasive, but on screen, engagement with dispensational theology was scarce. Okay? To paraphrase Neil Postman one more time, what happened in the 1980s was not that pop dispensationalism became the dominant content of television, but that television shows became one of the dominant purveyors of a reduced version of dispensationalism. Televangelists were indispensable in disseminating pop dispensational understandings of end-time concepts, rapture, Antichrist, tribulation, Armageddon, and the pattern of crisis thinking defined by the humanist tribulation. They too had come in many cases unwitting representatives of the dispensational tradition that carried forth a heightened eschatology vision of the near future, not just for faithful dispensationalists, but for a wide swath of Americans. That brings us now to the second subsection of Chapter 17, CCM and the Pop Dispensational Complex. To some observers in the 1980s, this is page 288, it appeared as if televangelism was a wave of the future. But a string of high-profile scandals in 1987 and 1988 assured that televangelism would not become the preeminent driver of religious culture into the 1990s. Jimmy and Tammy Faye Baker, Jimmy Swaggart, and other Assembly of God televangelist Marvin Gorman all fell into a mix of financial and sexual intrigue in the span of 18 months, while Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson saw the viewership decline dramatically because of their own assortment of scandals and public missteps. By the end of 1990, the total televangelist audience had plunged to below 8 million weekly viewers. This collapse was clarifying in one respect, revealing that televangelism was just one cog in a larger wheel churning pop dispensationalism into diffuse forms of religious culture. In the late 19th century, an institutional complex was erected by global missions-oriented new premillennialists. The older complex of institutions included Bible institutes, revival circuits, missions organizations, and religious publishers. The newer, late 20th century complex was comprised of televangelist megachurches, political advocacy groups, and cultural industries, both print and electric. The difference between the two illustrated how the underlying infrastructure of fundamentalism and evangelicalism had changed in a century. The older complex remained active. Bible institutes and seminaries continued to enroll students, prophecy conferences continued to be held, and premillennial authors had no shortage of publishing options. But the locus of authority had shifted towards the new. The change was decades in the making. Since the 1970s, the fracture in fundamentalist theology had continued to deepen, limiting the influence of older scholastic networks and confining them year to year to perpetuating their teachings to even smaller circles of followers. Collaboracy in the new Christian right also blurred old boundaries, revealing in its brassed form the widest reconstructioning of American religion. Religious communities, and especially Christians, were increasingly arrayed along a new cultural axis of traditional to progressive rather than older fundamentalist modernist axis that had organized so much of the 20th century Protestantism. The term evangelicalism, popularized in the 1970s, came to prominence in just this setting, offering not simply a theological or ecclesial identity, but also a label rooted in religious, cultural, and economic interests. By the 1990s, the locus of commercial power had shifted to the new pop dispensational complex, now firmly situated in the broader evangelical consumption ecosphere. Okay. The outburst of prophecy speculation, even in the early decade, was a stark piece of evidence illustrating how much more commercial sway pop dispensationalists had over their scholastic colleagues. On the occasion of the Gulf War in 1990, Charles Dyer, a former professor at Dallas Seminary, published The Rise of Babylon, Sign of the End Times, 1991, which argued that Saddam Hussein, as dictator of Iraq, as the historical land of the Babylonian Empire, was a potential prophetic figure. These scholastic efforts, they reprint also Walvard's Armageddon oil in the Middle East. I remember that as a kid in the 90s. The scholastic efforts were impressive relative to the religious offerings, but paled in comparison to pop dispensational sales in the same period. Lindsay writes a book, Megiddo Factor, in 1980. There's Planet Earth. Lindsay's next offering, Planet Earth 2000 AD. Will Humankind Survive? 1994. The following year, Tim LaHaye and fiction author Jerry Jenkins released their first Left Behind novel. The series would go on to sell more than 80 million copies. Judged on book sales alone, the Scholastics were less well represented in every other popular medium. The 1990s were decided in favor of pop dispensational publishing. Pop dispensational complex in the 1990s depended on these types of blockbuster sales. Across the religious landscape, there was more conformable vocabulary than pop dispensationalism. The growth of Christian contemporary music, or CCM, was a powerful case in point. Two musical traditions fed into CCM. Now, I'm not going to read all of this stuff about CCM. He gets into the history of CCM, and he starts talking about how they start writing songs about eschatological or pop dispensational themes. Okay, and he cites obviously Larry Norman from the 70s into the 80s. There were a couple people. He cites even like DC Talk. He cites Crystal Lewis. Some of these people, I'm loose. Rebecca St. James, Third Day. Different groups, different artists. Okay, page 291. It bears repeating that the thematic range of this pop dispensational music tradition was limited to end time themes. The doctrines of dispensational time and the Church Israel distinction were not music ready material, nor was any appeal to biblical literalism. Unlike worship hymns or confessional songs, CCM did not prize theological precision. Creators preferred a mix of emotive, narrative, and therapeutic lyrics that drew on the urgency and speculation of pop dispensational scenarios. This limited engagement with dispensationalism also reveals the limits of pop dispensational appeal in the genre as a whole. Other CCM visions of the future rooted in theological commitments also caught fire. The popular worship song For Future Generations, 1984, by the band For Him, talks about a couple other things like pop dispensational songs. The alternative eschatological vision had its own lines of influence in CCM, some advancing in a more reformed tradition, and some a Pentecostalism that emphasized the kingdom's power in the here and now. By the 21st century, in fact, pop dispensationalism, crowded out by already not yet lyrics describing the present kingdom, the dominant CCM acts in the new century included those that made their way into thousands of church worship sets: Chris Tomlin, the David Crowder Band, and Hillsong United, who had shed pop dispensational influence. So now we see the musical aspect of this, and then we get into the subsection here, mega dispensationalism and its limits. And this is going to get into sort of the influence of the mega churches, okay? He tells some backstory here that's interesting, but not anything that I'm necessarily going to cover. On page 292, he talks about sort of the conditions that allowed for the rise of the American megachurch movement. Interesting information, but not necessarily something I want to read. On page 293, he talks about Talbot Seminary alumni included John MacArthur and Kenton B. Shore. One famous graduate of Grace Theological Seminary, David Hocking, gained a large following at Calvary Church in Santa Ana, California. He's talking here about he talks about Chuck Smith and Calvary Church megachurches. These churches shared similar ministry models and identified in sometimes selective embrace of dispensational teachings. They were located in strategic growth areas including the greater areas of Chicago, Atlanta, and Dallas. He also mentioned Chuck Swindoll here, a couple others. In total, the story of modern megachurch growth could not be told without the contribution of dispensational trained pastors. But despite this story of success, the wider megachurch growth of the 1970s revealed demographic and theological limits of dispensationalism. The two most influential megachurch leaders in the late 20th century, Bill Hybels and Rick Warren, made a point to disassociate from the theology and indeed from theological factionism and continue to roil fundamentalism and evangelicalism. More to the point, the loose but expansive network of late-century megachurches professing New Calvinism and Neo-Reformed covenantal theology posed a stark theological contrast to dispensationalism. This megachurch revival and Reformed theology beginning in the 1980s stoked the factional infighting between dispensationalists and covenantalists that had defined fundamentalism since the 1930s. The leaders of New Calvinism were predominantly megachurch pastors, including John Piper, Tim Keller, and Kevin DeYoung, all members of the Presbyterian Church in America, as well as non-denominational Reformed teachers Charles Joseph Mahoney, or C.J. Mahoney, and Mark Driscoll. There also emerged a powerful Southern Baptist contingent that included Matt Chandler, Albert Mohler, and Mark Denver. Collaborative venues for this disparate group of New Calvinist leaders and churches included a network of networks umbrella, the Gospel Coalition, the Pastors Conference Together for the Gospel, T4G, and book publishers Crossway and Lifeway. The new evangelicals' allergy to dispensationalism was evident from the beginning. Take John Piper, a longtime pastor of Bethlehem Baptist Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Though born to a traveling dispensational evangelist, Piper was trained in the neo-evangelical institutions of Wheaton College and Fuller Seminary. At the latter school, Daniel P. Fuller, son of Charles Fuller, one of the leading neo-evangelical critics of dispensationalism, mentored Piper. As for his after a stint as a New Testament professor at neo-evangelical Bethel College and Seminary, Piper assumed the pastorate of Bethlehem Baptist Church, both in the Twin Cities. He increasingly became known for teaching a Baptist Reformed theology that rejected most key dispensational teachings while retaining a premillennial eschatology, which paved the way for his church's rapid growth and his own leadership in the New Calvinist movement. So this is so the New Calvinist movement is emerging now, divorced from dispensationalism, even pop dispensationalism. Okay, the elite levels of the New Calvinist megachurch leaders. Piper worked with another anti-dispensationalist, C.J. Mahoney. I think I'm saying that right. Founder of the Sovereign Grace Church in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. He planted his church in 1977 as part of the Jesus People movement and was initially influenced by little more than the Bible and late great planet Earth. It's not a pattern I'd recommend, he reflected years later. In the 1980s, with a fast-growing congregation, Mahoney was introduced to the works of Reformed tradition, John Calvin, the Puritans, Charles Spurgeon, which largely rid him of his dispensational convictions and connected him instead to Piper and other New Calvinists. Their cooperation would become more formalized in the decade 2000 to 2009 in networks like T4G, but would fracture again in the 2010s as allegations of mismanagement and sexual abuse in his ministries isolated Mahoney from other New Calvinists, many of whom were suffering public scandals of their own, which I would include Driscoll in that. Last Christmas break, I listened to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill Church podcast. It was very interesting to do that. Take but another example. So outside the dispensational covenant megachurch face-off, still other Christians incorporated dispensational theology in ways that served their unique interests, both spreading dispensational concepts and fraying its coherence as a system. Proponents of the prosperity gospel, rooted in Pentecostalism and teaching that financial and physical health are God's will, constituted another growth vector for megachurches. To take but one example, John Hagee, who I mentioned earlier, founder of Cornerstone Church in San Antonio, Texas, fused prosperity teachings, dispensationalism, and new Christian right activism to become one of the most influential pastors in the country. Hagee's father, a Pentecostal dispensational preacher, taught him that the day Israel declared its independence was, quote, the most important day of the 20th century. Now, I've seen hours of Hagee doing his shtick, promoting his books. You think back to 9/11, and Hagee was all over TV talking about prophecy and how all of this stuff was going to come to pass, and a very huge proponent of Christian Zionism. Okay, in fact, Hummel mentions that on page 295. He hosted his first annual night to honor Israel in 1981. Hagee's Christian Zionism included a wide range of political and theological arguments, for geopolitical prophecy analysis to a nation-based prosperity gospel that blamed American decline on insufficient support of Israel. And then page 296, concluding this section, ultimately Hagee's career illustrates another powerful manifestation of mega dispensationalism in the 21st century, one deeply tied to Pentecostal networks, otherwise distinct from fundamentalist, evangelical, and new Calvinist circles. The founding leadership board for Christian United for Israel included 6 Pentecostal megachurch pastors and an executive from the Christian Broadcasting Network. The non-Pentecostal on the board was Jerry Falwell, who died the year after the organization's founding in 2007. As a group, the leadership team revealed how a particular political manifestation of mega dispensationalism had found footing in the stratum of Pentecostal megachurches and had organized at a national level to influence U.S. politics and diplomacy. And then the last subsection is about the Southern Baptists and sectional rapprochement. And this goes on into sort of some of the history of dispensational thinking and teaching within the Southern Baptist Convention. I did not underline a particular lot of things in this subsection when I read it. Frankly, I'm not a Southern Baptist. I'm not too into the all the politics of that movement. But there are a couple things that I'll read here as we conclude discussing this chapter 17. None of the Southern Baptists, this is page 297, none of the Southern Baptist denomination seminaries, which counted six by 1970, taught dispensationalism, and in most cases isolated its doctrines as Northern imports. So in other words, the Southern Baptist seminaries into the 1970s, they were not teaching dispensational concepts, okay, by and large. So jumping to the end, page 298, the legacy of dispensationalism in the Southern Baptist Convention is a window into both scholastic dispensational production and pop dispensationalism, embedded dispensational ideas to spread in areas, especially in the South, that had a history of resistance. Over generations of sectional reconciliation, dispensationalism eventually found a wide hearing in the South, both at the level of theological education and in popular religious culture. At the same time, dispensationalism's uneven fate in the Southern Baptist circles mirrored its struggles in Northern fundamentalism. In neither setting did scholastic dispensationalism continue its momentum or even take permanent root after the 1960s. Among Southern Baptists, too, scholastic dispensationalism was the purview of a shrinking community of pastors and seminary professors, even as pop dispensationalism flourished on television and in Christian bookstores. In many cases where pop dispensationalism continued to make inroads, it did so at the cost of decrying theological coherence and scholastic authority. So in other words, as pop dispensationalism continues to churn in popular culture, it becomes dispensationalism itself, according to Hummel's argumentation, becomes less and less and less important and authoritative as it is stripped further of its theological, philosophical, and scriptural underpinnings. Okay. I say philosophical because dispensationalism is very much based on logic, right? That things that differ can't be the same. In fact, that's the title of Mr. Stam's book, right? And so, rightly dividing the word of truth, and dispensationalism becomes very much involved with this, understanding the difference between Israel and the church, between prophecy and mystery, between the rapture and the second coming, and those types of concepts. Okay, so pop dispensationalism is that's all eroding and no longer going to be understood by most people who are embracing pop dispensationalism. Just as one last thought, I remember when I was in Bible college, everybody was reading the Left Behind series. I have never been much of a fiction reader. I never read it. I will say I've watched a few of the movies, but I've never read the series. Just didn't really have interest or time to read the fiction. And some would say that's one of my great deficiencies in life, that I don't read enough fiction. Don't have time for it. I'm too busy with other things. So hopefully you've enjoyed that review of chapter 17, Saturation and Its Limits. Just want to remind you before you go, if you've never trusted Jesus Christ, if you've never relied exclusively on his death for you on the cross, his shed blood as the only payment for your sin, and his resurrection from the dead, you need to understand that God loves you and that Christ died for your sin. Jesus Christ shed his blood on the cross of Calvary to satisfy the offended justice of God against sin, so that he could offer you and I eternal life as a free gift. You can't earn your salvation. It's not based on keeping the law, going to church, putting money in the offering plate. Any of the things that you think are going to make you right before God are just going to leave you short of the glory of God. That's why Jesus Christ came. That's why he died on the cross. That's why he rose from the dead, to give you and I eternal life as a free gift. Trust Jesus Christ today before it's everlasting too late. Thanks for your attention, and we'll see you next time.